Hi folks. Today I'm going to take a look at this Lewis and Clark book I picked up at the used bookstore. I'm not really an expert on the Lewis and Clark trip, but I have read some about it. I think I forget as much as I remember about it though. Let's see, when was this book? This came out in 1998. So that's more than 20 years ago. 25 years ago about. So there might be some language in here that might not be described the same way. But of course, one thing about Lewis and Clark expedition is that it's so well documented. That's just, an incredible part about it and why we know so much about it. So here we can see some maps of the trip that they took, the areas. So in red is the journey west, starting in St. Louis through what's now Missouri, following the Missouri River to Iowa, Nebraska, South Dakota, and then connecting to the Yellowstone River, heading west through Montana, what is now Montana anyway, and then ultimately connecting to the Columbia River and finishing in northern Oregon, southern Washington. And that was the route out, and the route back is similar, except they went up to Great Falls earlier from Three Forks and then around. So this fork in the blue return journey, I assume, is two different groups. Maybe we'll learn about that. We won't get to that part, I'm sure, tonight. But so this expedition was 1804 to 1806. This is under President Jefferson's tenure. So I think this book covers some of the photos that it has would be some of the areas they went. I really haven't checked this out ahead of time. So I thought I'd flip through a little bit, and maybe we can come back in another video with more detail. But that's Jefferson there. And here's Alexander Mackenzie. So, born on the Isle of Lewis in Scotland's Outer Hebrides Islands, Alexander Mackenzie came to America at the age of 10 in 1774 when his father decided that New York held greater economic promise so maybe we'll learn more about that. This photo is a photo from the Appalachian Mountains, which was an inspiration for Jefferson. There's Monticello, Jefferson's home. This is a view from Virginia's Hawksbill Mountain. This is another inspiring photo. Here's a little quote from Jefferson in January 1803. While other civilized nations have encountered great expense to enlarge the boundaries of knowledge by undertaking voyages of discovery and for other literary purposes in various parts and directions, our nation seems to owe to the same object, as well as to its own interest, to explore this, the only line of easy communication across the continent, and so directly traversing our own part of it. Plans and preparations. Talking about how Jefferson had probably settled on his private secretary, Meriwether Lewis, to command the expedition before he even approached Congress. He had known Lewis almost since the latter's birth in 1774. This is a painting of Meriwether Lewis, who, according to a cousin, was confident, determined, and brave, and by many considered handsome. It's always amazing how young they were. Here's a looks like a supply list. It's compiled by William Clark. List of items carried by the expedition. There was a lot of documentation, but as this little note suggests, there's also a lot of conflicts in this documentation, so the makeup of the party and so on is still in question in some ways. I'm assuming this is maybe William Clark in that photo, or that painting. Or maybe this is William Clark. I'm not sure who that one is. William Clark, red-headed, 32 years old, and an experienced woodsman, was Lewis' first choice as co-commander of the expedition. It was an excellent choice. Lewis may have been better suited to inspire the men, but he also suffered from periodic bouts of depression. Clark, shown here in an 1807 painting by Charles Wilson Peale, had a steadier disposition and provided a stabilizing presence in the expedition. I mean, it's pretty amazing they made it all the way to the ocean, Pacific Ocean and back, with not having, that early, just at the turn of the 19th century, and there's no real known routes, established routes for Europeans at that time. The fact that they made that work. So, here's a map. The Louisiana Purchase. Just before Lewis set off, the nation doubled its size through the Louisiana Purchase, an acquisition of a great tract of land west of Mississippi. This 19th century map of the United States shows the impact on the nation of the Louisiana Purchase. West of Louisiana, parts of the continent were still claimed by Britain, Spain, and Russia. Through the summer and early fall of 1803, Meriwether Lewis made his way down the Ohio River. En route, he met up with William Clark, and together they began to recruit men for their expedition. Up the Missouri. So they would encounter a lot of native peoples throughout this entire trip. And there's a lot of stories that aren't often covered as that side of it, the interactions with the native peoples. Page 36, which is back here, this photo. Sandbars and drifting logs were just two of the problems that Lewis and Clark encountered as they ascended the Missouri. At first, they were also working against a current so strong that their boats rarely traveled more than 1 mile per hour. So up here, this map. After leaving St. Louis, members of the expedition spent 5 months from May to October 1804 rowing, poling, and towing their boats up the Missouri River to Mandan country. Here's a steamboat. The St. Louis of Lewis and Clark's day was much smaller than the city George Catlin painted in 1832, but it was just as important. By 1800, the town was already central to the western fur trade. Merchants there supplied trappers and traders with goods and bought their furs for export to Eastern and European markets. There looks like maybe this is a roster of people, it looks like. An official payment requisition lists the members of the Corps of Discovery, with each one's name, rank, dates of commencement and ending of service, length of service, rate, and amount finally due. Looks like it's got 31 names on that page. What's this little box say? As Lewis and Clark ascended the Missouri, they had with them a map prepared in Washington that offered the latest geographic information on the route they were to follow. The map shows the Missouri for a few hundred miles west of St. Louis in the area immediately around the Mandan villages. What lay between those points, however, was anyone's guess. The map was folded when being carried. The hole in the middle and the edges demonstrate the wear and tear to which it was subjected. These two sketches by William Clark show the expedition's keelboat after it was modified at Camp Dubois. The overhead view clearly shows the storage lockers that lined both sides of the boat and the oars by which the men rowed it. The side view also shows the mast that was added but rarely used. Most of the time the men rowed the boat or pulled it with tow ropes. The Lewis and Clark expedition is one of the best documented journeys of early American history. The President's original orders to Meriwether Lewis had emphasized the necessity of carefully recording where the expedition went and what it found, and specified that several copies of this record should be made in case one was lost or damaged. In keeping with those orders, both Lewis and Clark kept journals of their travels. They also ordered each of their sergeants to keep a journal and encouraged the privates to do so as well. Though the Missouri is nearly a mile wide in many places, the boats generally hugged the shore, where the slower current made it easier to row or pull the boats upstream. Years after the Lewis and Clark expedition, the artist George Catlin paid his own tribute to Charles Floyd, the only member of the expedition to die en route. In 1832, Catlin painted the hill near the Sioux City, Iowa, on which Floyd was buried. 25 years later, the grave was moved to protect it from erosion by the river. Today it is marked by a large monument. Indian negotiations were almost as important as exploration to Lewis and Clark. Two important elements of Indian diplomatic etiquette were smoking and gift-giving. Among the gifts Lewis and Clark carried were medallions such as this one, which they usually presented only to men they took to be tribal leaders. Yeah, they had a store of just crates and crates of gifts. Let's see what this little piece says. It's by William Clark, October 13, 1804. The prisoner pled not guilty to the charge exhibited against him. The court, after having duly considered the evidence adduced as well as the defense of the said prisoner, are unanimously of opinion that the prisoner, John Newman, is guilty of every part of the charge exhibited against him, and do sentence him agreeably to the rules and articles of war to receive 75 lashes on his bare back, and to be henceforth discarded from the permanent party engaged for northwestern discovery. 2/3 of the court concurring in the sum and nature of the punishment awarded, the commanding officers approve and confirm the sentence of the court, and direct the punishment take place tomorrow. So in this period, corporal punishment was still in place in the military. This drawing here, this 19th century illustration from the published version of Patrick Gass's journal captures the formal nature of Lewis and Clark's meetings with Indians of the Missouri River Valley. The captains put on their best uniforms and often had their troops pass in review before the speech-making began. And I've read some about these interactions with native peoples. And a big part of the way that Lewis and Clark saw it is they wanted to put on a big show and really show that sort of like the Americans are coming and we are in charge and we're powerful and you're going to want to work with us. And so they would do that. They had a cannon on the boat and they'd fire the cannon and do all kinds of showing. And of course, like I said before, they also had all those gifts they would give. And from what I've read, these speeches could go on and on and on. I mean, hours of speeches. And this painting. Natives, too, did their best to impress visiting dignitaries. Among some tribes, including these Teton Sioux, painted by George Catlin, one of the great honors paid important visitors was a feast of dog, according to John Ordway. When Lewis and Clark met the Teton Sioux, the Indians killed several dogs and cooked them in a decent manner to treat our people with. Different rituals and cultures. So this is relatively early in the journey, the Mandan winter. So we're going to probably get a description of that photo. Mandan homes such as these reconstructed in North Dakota were perfectly suited to the harsh winters of the northern plains. Thick walls of dirt and sod provided insulation, and the tunnel-like doorway acted as an airlock to keep out cold air. So we're talking like North Dakota winter. Above this map, Lewis and Clark spent the winter of 1805 very comfortably at the fort they built among the Mandan people. This drawing or painting. In Lewis and Clark's day, the Mandan lived in two villages on the Missouri, like this one painted later by George Catlin. Catlin depicted the circular lodges around a central plaza that was typical of Mandan villages, and in the center of the plaza, the wooden enclosure surrounding a cedar post that represented Lone Man. And down here, this view of the Knife River shows clearly the river bluffs on which the Mandan and Hidatsa chose to build their villages. Bottom land between the bluffs and the river provided fertile land for crops. Villages sat safely above the floodplain, and villagers could watch the river for arriving friends or enemies. The Mandan world. The Mandan lived in a world of villages, though most white Americans, including Lewis and Clark, generally thought of Indians in terms of tribes or nations like their own. Mandan life was much less centralized than that. Ties of language and culture did create a wider Mandan identity, but life revolved around individual villages. Their villages generally stood on bluffs at the edge of the Missouri River's floodplain. Before the Missouri was dammed in the 20th century, it flooded every spring across a wide river bottom. The Mandan built their villages just above this flood zone, close enough to exploit the fertile soil left by centuries of flooding, but safely above the water's reach. Below the villages, Mandan women grew the corn, beans, squash, and sunflowers that provided much of their family's food. The rest of their food, plus skins for their clothing and bone for tools, came from buffalo and other game, killed by the men during regular hunting expeditions onto the Great Plains. Villages were also the center of social and political life. Each had its own Okipa lodge, the center of ceremonial life, its own set of the 13 clans into which Mandans divided their population, and its own set of 2 chiefs, a peace chief and a war chief, one for each situation. By the time Lewis and Clark arrived, disease and pressure from the better armed Teton Sioux had reduced the number of Mandan villages from 12 or more to 2. Mandan culture, however, remained intact and impressed Lewis and Clark mightily. "They are brave, humane, and hospitable," wrote Clark, who also called them the most friendly, well-disposed Indians inhabiting the Missouri. And this one, George Catlin's painting of the Mandan medicine man, Old Bear, shows the leather leggings and moccasins that William Clark described as typical among Mandan men in 1804. According to Clark, though, most wore a breechcloth made of a folded blanket, while Old Bear here wears an animal skin. Though farming was the Mandan's chief source of food, they also hunted buffalo. This 1844 lithograph by George Catlin shows one of their techniques. A circle of mounted hunters surrounded the buffalo and, on a signal, began riding around the herd in an ever smaller circle until they trapped and killed a number of the animals. York, William Clark's slave, was often a source of fascination among Indians the expedition encountered. Most had never seen a black white man, and some, such as the Hidatsu, shown in this painting by Charles M. Russell, tried to rub York's color off. This is speaking about what looks to be a letter or journal. Meriwether Lewis's journal entry for February 3, 1805 describes the Corps' efforts to free their boats from the frozen Missouri River. Attacking the ice with axes had failed, as had trying to melt it by heating water inside the boats. As the denier resort, Lewis planned on assault. Planned an assault using iron spikes attached to the ends of wooden poles. That was a little smudgy, that's why that was hard to read. During the winter at Fort Mandan, John Shields and Alexander Willard, the Corps of Discovery's blacksmiths, made dozens of axes like this one, drawn by William Clark down here. Initially, Lewis and Clark traded them to the Mandan and Hidatsa for corn. From there, however, the axes entered a native trading system that stretched beyond the Rockies. A year later, as the Corps crossed Idaho on the way back from the Pacific, John Ordway found Nez Perce Indians gambling with axes made at Fort Mandan. Well, I think we'll end this part of this Lewis and Clark expedition look through with this chapter 5, Into the Unknown, in a future episode or a future video. Well, I hope you enjoyed this video and found it relaxing. If so, please like the video and subscribe to the channel if you're not already a subscriber. And if you are a subscriber, thank you for subscribing. And above all, everyone, thanks for watching. We'll catch you in the next video. Good night.